It's great to see everybody back. I hope that your conversations during the first dialogue groups were fruitful and that you're refreshed and well awake and ready to go after lunch. I am very excited to introduce you to our next keynote speaker, Dr. Korie Little Edwards. Dr. Edwards is an associate professor of sociology at The Ohio State University. She's a leading scholar examining race and religion in the United States. After working as a professional civil engineer for several years, Dr. Edwards went through what she describes as an awakening of sociological imagination, whereby she came to an awareness that how we experience our life is in no small part impacted by social forces outside of ourselves. Dr. Edwards led a national study of multiracial church pastors called the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project. The RLDP is regarded as the most in-depth, comprehensive project ever conducted on leaders of multiracial congregations. Her book, The Elusive Dream, The Power of Race and Interracial Churches, shares a name with the Elusive Dream podcast, which she co-hosts. She also serves as editor-in-chief for the Journal of the Scientific Study of Religion. Her most recent book is Smart Suits, Tattered Boots, Black Ministers Mobilizing the Black Church in the 21st Century. After Dr. Edwards' talk, we'll hear from our local respondent, Kateri Dillon. Kateri works as the program coordinator of the Bruner Literacy Center, a nonprofit sponsored by the Sisters of the Precious Blood, which offers free one-on-one tutoring to adults. The center is the only adult literacy center in the Dayton area. They've journeyed alongside hundreds of adults learning English as a second language, working on math and reading skills, and preparing to obtain their GEDs. Kateri first joined Bruner as a Marianist volunteer in 2016 after her graduation from John Carroll University. She also serves as the assistant head for spirituality for the Marianist lay communities of North America and is a member of the Dayton Marianist Family Council. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Korie Little Edwards.
Hello, everyone. Such a delight to be present with you. I'm going to look at this large podium up here. Is this how they do it in law schools? Very large podiums. Yes, so really, really excited and happy to be here. I think this is a wonderful kind of conference to put on. I'm really a proponent of bridging the practice with knowledge. I think it's just critically important. It's one of the primary reasons why I do the work that I do. So to be present with you in this type of conversation, to be invited to be a part means a lot to me. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'd like to start off telling you a little bit about myself. I think it's important to do that following in the spirit of Patricia Hill Collins. She is a Black feminist, and she talks about our standpoints and how our standpoints matter. And one way to think about that is this is just a constellation of our statuses and our perspectives. And so it just gives you a little bit of insight about me as I share what I'm going to be talking about with you today. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's something that Vincent and I have in common. And I grew up in the actual city of Pittsburgh. I am a daughter of the Black church. So I went to church when I was young. I went to my mom's church. It's a church she went to with her parents. This was the Baptist church. It was a largely liturgical church. We had hymns. You were pretty conservative. It was a little bit on the quieter side. But then for most of my upbringing, I went to a larger Baptist church in the Pittsburgh area that had a bit of a Baptist-costal feel to it. So, it wasn't just Baptist. I had a little bit of, extra going on there. And I was actively a part of the Sunday school. I was a part of the youth choir. This is a church where tambourines were available for you to pick up on the way in. And so I learned how to play the tambourine to the gospel music. My pastor was a good preacher, a really great preacher. long sermons, long services when I was growing up. So I just have that, that's kind of those are my roots, right? That's kind of where I'm situated growing up. As an adult, my spiritual life has been in multiple places for a snippet of time. I attended a largely white megachurch for a few years, but then most of my adult life, I have attended either multiracial churches or predominantly Black churches, all of which have been headed by Black men. So the point is this: the Black church, though, really is that's my heritage, sort of my roots, and that's really the place where I feel at home, right? In many ways, spiritually, right? Even though I am actively engaged in a multiracial church. Now that's who I am. Now I'll tell you a little bit about what I do as a scholar. So for the first part of my career, I looked at race and religion in the organizational context. And you'll see I have a couple books that I either wrote or as an author or co-authored, The Elusive Dream and Against All Odds, and talk a little bit more about that later. But I also did some work on the Black church, particularly just understanding Black church religious practices. But I would say most of my work, and I'm more well known, particularly in that first part of my career, as doing stuff on the multiracial church. But actually, midway into my career, and it's in part because of the work that I did with churches, is really came to understand how important religious leaders are. That religious leaders matter, and they don't have to be dictatorial, but they just matter for the direction of the organization. And a lot of scholarship was showing that, but I really wanted to focus on that. So for the past 10 years, my research has actually looked at pastors, religious leaders. And so I was already in the introduction, I shared a little bit about this. One of these projects that I headed is the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project. And this is the first ever comprehensive multi-method national study of multiracial church pastors. This was funded by the Lilly Endowment. It's a $500,000 grant. I'm grateful for them to give me that money to do that. And then I also did a study called the Religious Leaders and Civic Activity in Ohio Project. And this was a multi-method study of Black religious leaders in particular. So the RLDP is not just Black, not just one sort of racial identity, it's diverse. But the religious leaders in civic activity in Ohio focused on Black religious leaders in the state, and also civic leaders who wanted to work with them. Now, in my research on leaders, I do have a particular sort of framework, right? I believe, and it was already mentioned in my introduction, I think it's really important for us to pay attention to context. That we don't just look at the person, we look at the context in which they are embedded. And so this here is how I think about the religious leader. Right, that people who are leading, and religious leaders in particular, have ideas about how they're going to lead, right? That's their self. But then we also have to take into account what's going on at the micro level. And for religious leaders, that micro level would be their congregation, the people that they're regularly interacting with. But you also have to take into account what I say is at the meso level. You're talking about your peers, your pastor peers, your religious leader peers, the religious denomination, because that has an impact on how you see yourself as a leader. But then also we want to take into account what's going on at the macro level. Right? We can't dismiss that there are forces that are really sort of broad in society that impact how people on the ground do what they do. In this case, religious leaders, and there are two that I focus on. These aren't the only ones that matter, but I tend to focus on two. And one is, how is it that religion is done in the United States? And so religion in the United States is completely voluntary. We have this thing that we colloquially call the separation of church and state that has very important implications for how religious leaders go about doing their work. And then we have this thing called race and white supremacy. And we have a society that is deeply connected and rooted in race and a racial hierarchy. So I take those into account as I understand and try to make sense of what religious leaders are doing on the ground. Now, my most recent work, as I just mentioned to you, the book that came out from the Religious Leaders in Civic Activity in Ohio project is Smart Suits, Tattered Boots. And it was based upon the research that came out of this project. Now, this project has 54, my colleague and I now, at the time she was my graduate student, she's also the co-author of the book. I'll give a shout out to her. Her name was Michelle at college. She does a lot of great work on FBCOs, and she's at Muskegon University now as an assistant professor. But she and I, we conducted interviews with Black religious leaders in the state, and as I mentioned, civic leaders, and there was 54 interviews total. We did 43 with pastors, we did 11 with civic leaders, particularly those who would want to work with Black religious leaders. But what we also did is we did some observations of the kinds of activities that Black religious leaders were engaged in at the time. Now, I have to say that I actually wasn't going to do this project. I actually wasn't planning on it. I had already begun to think about the RLDP. I was actually developing that grant and moving forward to developing that grant to submit to Lilly. But this is what happened. It's 2012. Anybody remember what's going on in 2012? We are in the great state of Ohio, and it's 2012, and I'm sitting in the pews of my church at the time, which is a largely Black church. And what I was experiencing was just something different. I just felt like we were being told, we're being mobilized. And the reason why I want to emphasize the feeling, and I think this is something that's really important, and I encourage this in my students, and I try to practice it in my life, is that sometimes you just kind of go with what you're feeling. And I say you're feeling intellectually. And what I was feeling intellectually is that something was different this time. Now, it's not that we hadn't been encouraged to vote in the church before. It's not that I hadn't seen candidates come to service and be asked to stand up, and we look at it, we clap, and they sit back down. That had happened before, but I felt that there was something different. And so I decided to talk to my former graduate student at the time, and I said, would you be interested in doing this study with me? She said yes, got IRB approval, and jumped in the field. Now, what is going on at the time in 2012? Well, what's happening in 2012, as you remember, is we have the re-election of the first Black president, but there's also something else going on. What we also have to remember is it's the beginning of the swell of the Black Lives Matter movement. This was Trayvon Martin had been murdered by George Zimmerman. There was not, from what many understand, not appropriate justice as it relates to that killing. And so you have this re-election of the first Black president that's happening at the same time that you're having a major swell as it relates, as we understand it, to be Black Lives Matter. And so I wanted to take advantage of this time. And what made Ohio really interesting, and we have to remember, we don't probably feel like a battleground state anymore, but we used to be a battleground state for big time, right? If you remember at that time, we were getting a ton of ads that we were hearing. I couldn't turn on the radio or TV without being told that, something or other. And so at that moment, we also are being really encouraged, right, to participate politically. Right? The first Black president, it's a battleground state, and then we have the swell of the other. So I'm jumping into the field in this context. So I wanted to understand this. I wanted to know when, how, and why do Black religious leaders collectively mobilize in 21st century America? I just felt like there's something going on. Now, this is the deal. We do know that Black religious leaders do mobilize at the local level. And it's not uncommon for Black religious leaders to do community activism in their neighborhoods, for example, either just themselves or maybe with 2 or 3 other pastors in the neighborhood. That we know was common. But I was in many ways motivated by the work of Alden Morris and the origins of the civil rights movement, where what he really demonstrated is that there was this real social network of Black religious leaders in churches that was really important for a movement that spanned a broad space, not just the neighborhood, but really something that impacted a region. So that's really what I was interested in, not just collective mobilization at the very local level, but what does it look like when it's at a broader level? So I'm just going to highlight the 4 factors that I found real quickly, but then I'm going to hone in on one. There were 2 external factors that impact when, how, and why Black religious leaders were mobilizing, collectively mobilizing. And then there are 2 internal factors that I found. The external factors had to do with their relationship with civic organizations, and also how post-civil rights racism, racial discrimination works in America. Those are the external factors. And then the internal factors are what we call the civil rights movement credential and the Black Protestant ethic. Now, I'm not going to focus on all of that. Obviously, we wrote a whole book on it, so I'm just going to focus on the relationship to civic organizations, really in many ways also because that is what this conference is about. So I'm going to emphasize that. Now, there's something that's important to know here, is that out of the study, I found that Black religious leaders maintain a great deal of nostalgia for the civil rights movement and its pastor leaders. And this really had an impact on how they would go about mobilizing and why they would make sense of mobilizing. Now, many of the civil rights movement era Black-centered and usually Black-led civic organizations still exist today. And actually, what's interesting about Ohio is we have some of the 4 main ones, actually. Not all states do, right? In Ohio, we have the NAACP. There are multiple chapters of the NAACP, the SCLC, the Urban League, and even Al Sharpton's National Action Network. So all 4 are here in the state of Ohio. And as I mentioned, we had an opportunity to speak to many of the people who were leaders in these civic organizations. Surprisingly, though, most of the religious leaders in our study were not deeply engaged with these Black-led civic organizations. And this was really kind of shocked us. We weren't expecting that. They actually had symbolic connections. That is to say, what I mean by symbolic is that they had memberships. They were members of these organizations, but they weren't engaged in any substantive way. Now, that's not to say all of them. I'm just saying there was a pattern of not being as substantively engaged and having these symbolic connections. And in fact, when it was talked about, it was sort of talked about a little sheepishly, like, oh, no, no, we don't. I am a member, but I haven't been to the meetings in such and such time. Alternatively, FBCO is an option that many pursued, faith-based community organizing. And I think I needed to explain that here, but faith-based community organizing. And in fact, I think a part of that is because of the expansion of FBCOs really since the 70s, right? That may have something to do with it. And what that means is that Black religious leaders today, unlike the civil rights movement era prior, have other options for mobilizing and to bring together resources. But this is the theme. FBCOs are multiracial coalitions of faith communities. They use community organizing methods to work on a variety of different social justice issues. Many are led by whites, and particularly those that are the actual ones who are working with, let's say, IAF or something like that. They're also funded, funded by organizations that are largely white. So the Catholic Campaign for Human Development and other philanthropic organizations fund FBCO work. It's not to say that churches aren't providing resources, constituent churches they are, but a lot of that funding is coming from places that are institutionally connected to white organizations or white-led organizations. So FBCOs pursue economic and racial justice goals that many Black religious leaders support, for sure. However, tension and distrust can emerge both between Black religious leaders and FBCO, as well as within the Black religious leader community, particularly when Black churches are contributing significant resources to campaigns that aren't centering around Black specific issues. Still, many of the religious leaders in our study were involved with FBCOs. So the question that we wanted to interrogate a bit is, so why would Black religious leaders choose to work with these organizations instead of Black-centered civic organizations? And one of the reasons is they saw the utility of community organizing methods and having the support of that professional support staff. So this is really important. This is important because if you think back to the civil rights movement and what Alden Morris was arguing and others, is that a lot of those resources were coming out of the churches, right? What's happening when you have FBCO is you have resources that the church doesn't have to expend. So it's attractive to religious leaders, it's attractive to pastors to not have to rely on the church-based resources. Here's an example of a typical pastor in our study who had been involved in FBCO. Now, this person actually was once very involved in an FBCO organization, but actually had eventually backed away. And so reflecting on their prior experience, this is what they had to say. I mean, so I might be up here talking in front of the meeting, but how did you get all these people in a meeting? We had staff that built relationships and called these people 50 times trying to get them all here. And it's a heck of a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. But for most of our organizations, we don't have staff dedicated to the outreach, collaboration, building type piece. You see all that, the availability of those resources. So this pastor saw the value of the FBCO model for organizing and community mobilization. And later in the interview, this person notes that Black-centered civic organizations lack the financial resources to support organizing staff. Upon reflecting on this further, though, the person says this, pastors in particular. Some of them are getting involved just because of the vision of that interracial, multicultural type stuff. This is talking about other pastors, this idea about why they're involved. Some are getting involved because it's the best thing around. Because as much as we would like to have these Black coalitions, it don't look like it's happening anytime soon, or it's not strong enough. So they jump on that. That is the FBCO. Most of the religious leaders who spoke about FBCO drew a sharp distinction between multiracial coalitions and Black coalitions that focus on Black issues. Now, in this pastor's mind, being a part of a multiracial coalition was attractive for some Black religious leaders. It was, but for him, the idea would have been to have a Black coalition. However, that possibility seemed unlikely, at least in the near future, because of the amount of resources that would be needed and that were available. So why do Black religious leaders work with FBCO? Or what about those that are really engaged? So we see that in this pastor's view, Black religious leaders worked with multiracial FBCO because it was the best thing around and provided resources like organizing staff. You could help build relationships. You could pull off these really large meetings, right? I mean, 50 phone calls, that's a lot. That's a lot of time, right? But then you have those who are much more committed than this person. And I have to say that it's not completely this, but it tended to be among those younger Black pastors, and also Black religious leaders who weren't as centrally located in the Black religious leader network, who were more actively committed to doing work with the FBCO. So I just have an example here of a young pastor in the city, and this is what they said as they were talking about their engagement with FBCO. Oftentimes, he says, I would engage in efforts via clergy organizations, ministerial organizations, which certainly have their value. But I thought, with respect to mobilizing people for large-scale change, that the community organizing model, which looks at congregational involvement at the level of the pastor, but also at the level of involving the laity, you know, to me, that is a game changer. Goes on to say, one of the great things with the Black Ministerial Alliance, so this pastor is involved with both, is it provides a great clearinghouse of information. With the group meeting on a weekly basis, we are made aware of new developments. Community leaders, political leaders, public officials will come to those meetings and inform us about what they're doing. So we will be informed as religious leaders, one, to weigh in on it, to provide feedback. Sometimes we'll share this information with our congregation as a community resource to communicate information to them. There are always times when it is necessary. There are also times when it is necessary that we as Christian leaders speak out, particularly those who are African American within the city, and because of the acute issues that affect us here. Now, this young, and I want to add, respected pastor has chosen a different path of social engagement than older, more established pastors, at least in this stage of this person's career. He was committed to mobilizing for social change through the FBCO model. So he was content with working outside of the Black church. Now, this doesn't mean the Black church didn't matter to him. It did. The Black Ministerial Alliance that he was affiliated with was especially helpful as an information repository, a place where Black pastors could learn about and share information that was relevant. They developed and refined their collective voice in the Alliance. They were also connected with other people, with other civic leaders through the Alliance. But for him, the Black Ministerial Alliance was not the place for which he mobilized for social change. In fact, he proposed it was the FBCO that was carrying on the tradition of mass mobilization honed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other Black religious leaders of the civil rights movement, which he mentioned later on in the interview. So, this young respected Black pastor did not feel bound to any expectations that he should invest in the Black religious leader community. This could have been potentially problematic. Others in the Black religious leader network took notice of this. And one established activist-oriented pastor who was well respected in the network and had civil rights movement credentials expressed concerns about young Black pastors' approaches to social action. He discussed this at length in my interview with him, bringing up the topic completely on its own. I think in some instances, some of the pastors come from Eastern Ivy League seminaries. And I think their training, it's like anti the folk church. This is how I interpret it. And I don't ever want to become so educated or so intelligent that I cannot relate to what I call my everyday folk pastors. Some of these pastors are very linked to a strong interfaith movement and FBCO in the city. I don't have a problem with that. But I decided that this was a season where a lot of the young pastors that had come back into the city ought to be spending as much time with the Black pastors in organizing within the context of the heart and the soul of the Black community versus some larger external interfaith effort. I think you can see a lot of different ideas there. Bringing up the idea of the seminary, this Eastern Ivy League seminary, you went off, you got different ideas. You can't relate to who we are anymore when you come back. We are no longer, or they are no longer the kinds of people that you feel like you can work with. So you go over there with the big interfaith, multiracial group to mobilize. So it's clear that this sort of older, established, activist pastor perceived that young Black pastors ought to be working with their peers who are embedded in the Black church, rather than working with a diverse organization that's not rooted in the heart and soul of the Black community. Now, to be honest with you, time will tell if this young pastor will stay involved in FBCO. As of recently, we know that this person is. But one of the patterns that we saw in our research and our interviews is that pastors will be engaged in FBCO early on in their careers, but as they got to mid-career, they were no longer engaged or interested, and there are various reasons that they've expressed for that. However, this is a new generation, and diversity is a dominant value in the United States today, one that is expressed across institutions. So if the Black Religious Leader Network is not effectively mobilizing for social change that improves the lives of African Americans, then perhaps some of the younger generation of Black religious leaders in the 21st century will decide that the FBCL, a multiracial approach, is the way to go. But is diversity the way to go? Is diversity in collective action and racial justice the way of the future? More than at any other time in US history, diversity is celebrated. From the boardroom to the classroom, from Hollywood to the newsroom, people talk of wanting and valuing diversity. There are diversity rankings for schools. There's diversity in the workplace. There's diversity rankings as it relates to places to live, even houses of worship. And saying that you care about diversity is nearly a must for all leaders of institutions and organizations. Yet, right alongside America's professed love affair with diversity, racial strife and injustice persist. We see systemic police killings of Black people, many of them children, violence toward Asians, families separated at the border, to a resurgence of white supremacist groups across the globe, and mounting challenges to educating people about the social and historical facts of racism and racial discrimination. And my work on multiracial churches and pastors of multiracial churches gives me pause when it comes to the whole diversity as a solution to issues of justice. In the elusive dream and against all odds, one of the things that I have found is that multiracial churches work to the extent that white people are comfortable. And what I find is that whiteness in these spaces is normalized, and that even in spaces where people of color are the numerical majority, and even in spaces that are led by people of color, we will see this normalization of whiteness. And that these churches work in this way because they are governed by white hegemony. And this finding is not just what I found, but other subsequent work after me has supported this as well. So I'm going to go on to my next study to kind of help us to begin to understand this event. We talked about Black leaders and their engagement in collective mobilization. Now I'm going to draw upon my research with the RLDP to help us understand how is it that religious leaders are navigating issues of diversity and perhaps justice in their religious spaces. So the RLDP is a study of pastors of multiracial churches, as I already said, and in many ways I'm also trying to look at their capacity for social change. Now the RLDP is made up of 121 interviews. We did 121 interviews, most of them, nearly all of them face-to-face. This is obviously pre-COVID, 2014, 2016, face-to-face with pastors across the country and all of our 4 different census regions. We also did focus groups with a subset of the congregants of people of those pastors as well. So we have that data too. And then we also did surveys with people who were a part of some of their churches. And we have about 700 people that participated in a survey. So we have a real wealth of data, and we're continuing to work through that data. It's also a really diverse sample. I'm really grateful for this. We worked really hard at it. Our sample is made up of people who are heading churches of only 100 people. We also have people in the sample who are heading churches that are giga churches, that is 10,000 people or more. We have people who are mainline Protestant. We have people who are Catholic. We have people who are evangelical. So it's a very diverse sample. We have people that are different racial backgrounds. So people who identify as Anglo or white, people who are Hispanic, people who are African American or Black, people who are Asian. So it's a very diverse sample in that way too. It's also diverse across sexuality, and it's also diverse across gender. Worked very hard, I have to admit, had to work very hard to get women head clergy in the survey. That was beating the bushes like crazy for reasons that you can imagine, but they're there. So a very diverse sample of religious leaders, but the thing that's the same is that these are multiracial churches that they're heading in the United States. Now, multiracial churches now, most recent data shows, to give you some context, they make up about 15% of churches in the US. What we also know is that for a while there, it was actually Catholic churches that made up the largest proportion of multiracial churches, but actually now what we're seeing over the past decade or so is that it's evangelical churches that we've seen the fastest growing proportion of multiracial churches and also have the largest number of multiracial churches. So we're seeing this growth, right? This moving toward diversity in churches. And yet and still what's clear is that there's a high degree of segregation, right? Because 85% are homogenous. As I mentioned, that we see this considerable growth over the past decade in evangelical multiracial churches. My co-author of Smart Suits, Tattered Boots wrote one of the articles in a series of articles that my team did using the RLTB called Racial Reconciliation as a Suppressive Frame in Evangelical Multiracial Churches. And I just want to draw your attention to some of her analysis, which shows that a majority of people that are part of the evangelical church, these are pastors, draw on what we call racial reconciliation frames, as opposed to racial justice frames. Now, this particular study focused on evangelicals, but I would suggest to you that many of the ideas that are in it are also still relevant for other types of religious affiliations or Christian affiliations as well. And what you'll see here is that most of these what we found is most of the evangelical church pastors deployed a racial reconciliation frame to understand and deal with racial issues. And this is a frame that emphasizes shared faith and building interpersonal relationships across race. Where a racial justice frame emphasizes openly discussing racial injustices, the racial reconciliation frame views conversations about racial inequality as political and divisive. And thus, these conversations ought to be avoided to preserve unity in the church. The racial reconciliation frame is dominant in the white evangelical subculture, which most multiracial evangelical churches are embedded. It's very important to go back to those concentric circles. Where are these pastors in these churches embedded? The racial reconciliation frame also suppresses the ability to talk about issues of racial justice, right? It actually sort of breaks it off even in advance in the effort to maintain unity. So these pastors are drawing on the racial reconciliation frame, prioritizing unity and discouraging dialogue that calls into question what? Whites' resource accumulation and cultural dominance. That's ultimately what's happening. Racial inequality cannot be addressed, though, through ignoring racial issues. Or, as what's happening in this case with the focus on the relationships, is an individualistic interpretation of racial inequality. The bottom line is this: the racial reconciliation frame preserves white dominance, even if that is not the conscious intent, and I do want to emphasize this, of those who deploy it. We sometimes can get ourselves locked into trying to prove that people are intentionally trying to do something, and that's not necessarily helpful. Now, what's happening here, as I already mentioned, is that in many ways we want to avoid this because it is political. And this is what does happen when you have racially diverse congregations, is that not only are they going to be racially diverse, but because in many ways, particularly when you're talking about African Americans and whites, that you're going to have those political affiliations kind of aligning along race. So you're going to have political division. And this is what one of the Black evangelical pastors has to say about what they have to deal with. He says, look, we have people who think that Obama is probably the next best thing. And then you have people who probably think he's close to the Antichrist. marginalized. This is what you have in your church and what you're trying to bridge. Fundamentally different ideas. Here's an Asian evangelical pastor that's talking about this as well, but also brings into dealing with something as it relates to BLM, in this case, Ferguson. He says this, it's not easy. You realize how different people are. You realize how challenging it is. Things that a homogenous culture would never have, like communications or disagreements about. Like in a multicultural sense, you're having to tread carefully at times. I mean, we'll use Ferguson, for instance. In a homogenous culture, whether Black or white, this can be a real rallying, unifying thing, you know, for whichever perspective. But in a diverse church, you're thinking, man, this is as a pastor, how is this person going to take it? How are they going to take it? And you know what? You say, you're going to offend someone most likely, so it's really hard. The point is this, that as a pastor or as a religious leader of diverse space, you are dealing with a lot of different ideas about how to deal with issues of racial inequality and racial justice. And some of those have to do with, let's just be personal and sit down and do a little kumbaya. And others are saying, no, we have to address this at a structural level. Others are saying, we don't want to talk about politics, let's avoid it. Others are saying, we have to. These are kinds of challenges that emerge when you bring in racially diverse groups to deal with issues. And it's important that we see them if we're actually going to be able to address it. Now, I'll say this actually, so I have the pleasure, as I already mentioned, of interviewing many Catholic priests of multiracial churches. And I will say, of the white multiracial church pastors in this study, and I know you said something different earlier, but I'll say this, Catholic priests of multiracial churches in the RLDP were the most aware of systemic racism and demonstrated the most investment in dealing with issues of racial injustice. And they were most willing to confront white parishioners. I don't know, maybe that's surprising if you're Catholic. Now, I should say this. This is important for context, is that they themselves in their interviews would talk about other priests who weren't doing it. So it's clear. It's clear, even, you know, I'm not Catholic, as I said, I grew up Baptist, but it was clear to me that they were definitely a minority, and maybe even a numerical minority, and a bit of an embattled minority, but also they were very willing to just stand and do the thing, right? And a part of that has to do with a few things. And these are structural issues too. And one, the pastors, the priests that would do this, had to kind of came into the priesthood in a distinct era. They were coming in the 60s, and you think of a couple things that were going on there, and in Vatican II, we're moving to Vatican II, and we're also have the civil rights movement. So a lot of their ministry and how they understood their ministry was formed by coming into it during that time. And also Catholic priests are tenured. So there's something, I mean, listen, so there's something very different, right? We're talking about evangelicals who are not, who can get fired, right? Like you said the wrong thing, pack your bags, homie, you're out, right? So there's a very different kind of structure that they're navigating. Nevertheless, they still did have to deal with resistance. It's not as if they did not. And that resistance came from congregants. It also came from the bishop. They had words to say about the bishop and the diocese. It also came from their peers, right? So it wasn't void of resistance, yet there were also structural factors that protected them in ways that perhaps other pastors weren't. However, I want to go ahead and just give you an example from one of these pastors. This is a priest that is serving in an urban context, is serving a congregation that actually is minority white, but it's largely Black immigrant and Latino, some whites. And he says this about somebody coming to him in his church as it relates to a center that the church has to deal with undocumented people. And this is what he says. They come, because they ask me, are these people illegal? Yeah. All these people are undocumented, I said. Oh, well, not all of them. Oh, you mean some of them are? Yeah, some of them are. That's why they're here, to get their things straightened out. They come for the immigration center. People said to me, one lady said to me, so somebody comes to your office and they're undocumented. Yeah. So why don't you call the police? I said, well, because we're a church. We're trying to get people back. We're trying to get people back on track and get their status adjusted and stuff. But they're illegal. I said, well, yeah, but I mean, they came here and they want to start a life, and we can help them do that. We're a church, by the way, we're not the police. But some people just couldn't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my point is this, that just to highlight that you have these different pockets of resistance, and there's different places where people are able to do that as religious leaders, and there's structures that impact that, right? And of course, there's something else I want to highlight here too, is that this is a white pastor. Right? And so when I talk about my next point here, this is important. Because often diversity and dealing with issues within spaces of diversity can be draining, lonely work. Well, for pastors of color in multiracial settings, I will say for people of color in multiracial settings, right? And that the dealing with this, with justice, it can become kind of a burden. And I'm gonna give you a few examples here of an Asian evangelical pastor. He's been doing the work. He's engaging the work with his congregation, trying to move his congregation forward on dealing with issues of, particularly at this time, Church of Black Lives Matter. And he says, I mean, there would be times when it would be a real struggle to feel like, man, am I even in the right? I know I'm leading this. I mean, I think I can do a much more effective job somewhere else. Among people who are just, again, much more, at least racially similar to me. And here's what's happened in the past few months that's proven that. There's been a sense at our church, especially with a lot of the Asian influx. I've been feeling much more comfortable in our church. Now, this is a pastor, this is the pastor saying this. And so this is, again, talking about the kinds of burdens and loneliness that comes on leaders of color, and then also people of color generally. Here's another, a Black pastor, a mainline pastor, that had this to say. It can be lonely, you know. And it's in those times, Jesus went to the mountaintop. Jesus went to the garden, you know. He went on the other side of the lake, right, to get his batteries recharged. So for me, going to the convocation of Black pastors, that is like me going to the mountain and getting recharged. So what you hear, again, is the Asian pastors, when I'm around other Asians, I feel more, and this pastor, a Black pastor of a multiracial church, says, I gotta bounce and be with other Black leaders, because doing this work can be burdensome. And then I want to show you this last example here. This is of a white evangelical pastor who I would say is quite aware, right, of the work, right? They're trying to do the work, and you'll see it here in this quote. But I have a segment highlighted in yellow for a reason. The pastor says this, well, getting involved in racial justice issues is a big deal. If, as a white leader, I'm using my position of power and privilege to address the education crisis in our city. And we as a church are addressing the jobless situation and mass incarceration that speaks to people of color. If we're addressing immigration issues that speaks to immigrants, or the threshold for a felony thing being so low, so a kid who steals an iPhone is a felon for the rest of his life. And that happened to a kid in our church. Because of becoming a multiracial church, I learned about so many things I didn't know about before. And we became motivated to get involved, because before the church became multiracial, these things didn't touch our lives. That's why it's not kumbaya. That's why it's so much more than that, but why it can be. Now, again, I appreciate this pastor and what this pastor is doing, but what's embedded in what this pastor says is that why it is a burden for people of color and pastors of color. Because you just learned that children could be put in jail for stealing a mouthful. You're being taught about this while we're actually trying to do the work. So it's an educational setting for you. And thus there's an added burden that that's resting on the shoulders of pastors of color, or leaders of color, even people of color in multiracial social action work that has to be acknowledged and realized. All right, so what are some summary points of thoughts that I'd like to highlight? Well, one, racial justice work in the US is not for the faint of heart. It just isn't. So first of all, we got to give I like to give all of us, myself, a lot of grace. We've got to be gracious toward one another. It's just hard work. Religious leaders who want to be involved in racial justice work must navigate constraints that exist outside of themselves. I find over and over that pastors feel a lot of this challenge is because it's so like it's just me, but not recognizing that what you're dealing with isn't about you or just your immediate circle. It's about something that's much bigger. So having that sociological imagination that I developed, I want religious leaders to gain that as well. Spaces with whites is the default culture and draws upon that default culture. And so affirming whiteness is something that's rewarded in spaces with white people, even well-meaning white people. And so being aware of that is important. What is the default here? How do we resist the default? And what is the implication for people for which that is not the default? Diverse justice work is tiring and lonely work for religious leaders of color. It's just hard. When you're on your own with your group, it's a lot easier and there's a lot more comfort there. There are engaged Catholic priests out there. That for me makes me excited, right? It's just about finding them and actually supporting them. I really think that would be a really good way to go. So really working on building those connections in that. And then a last thing I want to say that I think can get overlooked as it relates to these summary thoughts is that US Black religious leaders are the original agitators. The Black church has been doing this for a long time. Over 250 years, really. And you can start off with somebody like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who in the late 1700s said, you know what, we're leaving the Methodist Church, we're going to start our own thing. And I think it's really important for anybody who wants to push multiracial FBCO work to not ask why you don't follow what Black religious leaders and Black religious leader organizations are doing, given the success that Black religious leaders have had in this country for over a couple hundred years. And in fact, we could argue that the civil rights movement was in fact the most successful organic movement of religious leaders in this country. I can't go without mentioning Black Lives Matter, because that's where we are right now. And this was a moment where people erupted across this country and this globe in the spring and summer of 2020. But this was a movement actually that wasn't started by Black religious leaders. It wasn't even started by religious leaders at all. It was started by Black women, young Black women. One of them is queer. I think it's important for us to pay attention to that if we're going to see where faith community work has a place in the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Little Edwards, for sharing your research and insights with us. Given what we've all discussed this weekend so far about Dayton's history of systemic segregation, we can see how many of these trends from the keynote could be applied to Dayton. The pervasive presence of white hegemony, multiracial FBCOs competing for resources with Black-led organizations, and a history of violated trust between these groups. It can be daunting to think about how to address these generations-old challenges. But I do find a recent conversation with a friend to be energizing. I was attending a church service with a friend of mine from Nepal, now living in Dayton. At one point, she said to me, "You know what I don't understand about churches here? There are so many churches, but there are still so many people on the streets." She paused there, as if these two realities should be a very obvious contradiction. She went on to explain, in Nepal, almost every church had an orphanage attached. I find my friend's words striking for a number of reasons. It isn't that churches in Dayton and the US don't do meaningful outreach. They make important financial contributions to a variety of causes, but many churches do this through fundraisers and donations in a somewhat sterile way, which strikes me as very American and keeps us at a comfortable distance away from vulnerable people. If we were more in tune with the needs immediately surrounding us, it might not take us long to start asking questions about why there are massive differences in income, resources, and opportunities between many center city neighborhoods and surrounding suburbs. We may begin to ask how the combinations of Black-led organizations, multiracial FBCOs, and church communities in Dayton can best interrupt these cycles of poverty and exclusion. Based on Dr. Little Edwards' findings, I believe navigating these complexities on a local level involve a combination of following Black-led organizations, challenging white hegemony and multiracial FBCOs, and building bridges when this will advance racial justice interests. Personally, I work for a white-led nonprofit founded by two women religious, Sisters of the Precious Blood. This organization, Brunner Literacy Center, provides individualized tutoring for adults seeking GEDs, language and literacy acquisition, and other goals. My time at BLC has put me face to face with the gaping differences in opportunity between many North and West neighborhoods and my own middle-class Catholic upbringing here in East Dayton. In one instance, I was working with a student who was incarcerated and was improving his fundamental reading skills. I noticed this student looking at me very intently, and then he said, "I bet you've never stolen anything in your life, like not even a candy bar from a store." And I said to him, "Well, yes, but," and he was actually able to fill in that but on his own. He said, "Oh, but I bet you grew up in a nice neighborhood where people didn't steal things, where people had what they needed." And I confirmed all of this. And we just sat for a minute in the reality of this blatant injustice and the profound difference between our homes, which were physically just 5 miles apart. I hoped that as he looked down at his jail scrubs, he could at least see them as a product of a deeply unfair society, rather than a reflection of his own worth. This gap in life experience highlights why it is necessary for Brunner Literacy Center and other white-led organizations to continually assess whether we are centering the experiences of our students of color or our own experiences. It is critical that we demonstrate our trustworthiness through ongoing actions. Dr. Little Edwards has researched the importance of outreaches from Black-led faith communities. In Dayton, I'd like to offer the Omega Community Development Corporation as an outstanding example, which has been doing this since 1997. Omega CDC was founded by its sister organization, Dayton Omega Baptist Church, and as Brother Ray discussed last night, focuses on youth, family, and economic development through a multi-generational approach. By deeply investing in the community which surrounds it, Omega seems to reflect my Nepali friend's vision of church community more concretely than many US churches. Dr. Little Edwards' keynote also explored the value of multiracial collaborations. One organization which has widely invited collaboration from around Dayton is the Gem City Market, a grocery store which was built and owned by the Dayton community. It focuses on collective empowerment, and it utilizes a community room to host events around nutrition, urban gardening, health education, and much more. Its incubator organization, Co-op Dayton, has other transformative startup initiatives, including Unified Power, which democratizes ownership and control of land in West Dayton through real estate investment. While Gem City Market has drawn in member owners from all over Dayton, it is in need of sustained support from white people who have bought memberships and are living outside of the neighborhood. This kind of long-term support is critical and demonstrates trustworthiness for future collaborations. Not all of us have means to provide major financial contributions to social change organizations, but we do all need groceries. Gem City Market is a 6-minute drive from UD. Somehow, it can be easy for those of us in East and South Dayton to imagine that things across the Great Miami River are incredibly far away. In reality, Dayton has always been a relatively small city, only divided by manufactured barriers of redlining, highway construction, and manipulated geography. This keynote also points out that in a very real way, multiracial FBCOs compete for resources with Black-led organizations, and this includes volunteer labor. This is something that I wrestle with. Currently, I consider the amount of time I spend volunteering with the Marianists, the faith community affiliated with UD here. My desire to get more involved with Black-led reentry initiatives, such as the Montgomery County Office of Reentry and Writers in Residence, which both offer local opportunities to accompany restored citizens in their transition out of incarceration. I do value my involvement with regional and national Marianist councils for several reasons, including that it allows me as a Catholic woman to have some leadership role within the church. On the other hand, I do not want to be so immersed in the Marianist world that I don't have time to support Black-led social change organizations. Dr. Little Edwards' talk reminds me that these tensions about how to invest time and resources are healthy and require ongoing evaluation. She observed that she sees great potential in building bridges with social justice-minded Catholic priests if we can bridge the religio-cultural differences. I would suggest to Catholic priests in attendance and also lay endowed Catholics, I will include myself in this, that a critical starting point in this is doing some very deep listening to Black Catholics who have chosen to speak out about racial justice. As of 2015, 3% of US Catholics were Black compared to 12% of the total US population. And the more I listen to stories of Black Catholics, and I think the morning keynote addressed this pretty well, I am convinced that this is due to white Catholics actively closing doors to Black people. I recommend literature and online talks by Father Brian Massingale and Olga Segura. And for anyone like me who likes listening to podcasts, I recommend the Gloria Purvis podcast. She interviews some insightful guests on racial justice and other topics, including our morning keynote, as well as Father Bruce Wilkinson. For a local perspective, I recommend searching on YouTube for Sister Nicole Trahan's Being Black and Catholic, a Reflection. The Catholic Church teaches about personal sins and institutional sins, but I rarely hear Catholic Church leaders applying the notion of institutional sins to itself. If we Catholics can examine our personal sins multiple times each Mass, why can't we regularly assess our own institutional wrongs with the same regularity and openness to renewal? Why don't we more enthusiastically follow the lead of organizations like Black Lives Matter? By definition, Christianity involves following a brown man who comes from a poor family, and I believe we are capable of doing this to a greater extent. And because Catholics are known for providing great lip service to social justice, I do want to provide a concrete takeaway for all of us. I have a handout with a list of many Black-led and multiracial organizations working for racial justice. There's a QR code on it, so for those of you who are tech savvy or sitting near tech savvy people, you can access an online version of this form so that you can directly visit the websites of all of these organizations. And as we look at these many opportunities, and of course, these are just some of the very many opportunities in the Dayton area, I encourage you to keep networking with each other to learn about even more opportunities to engage. So as we approach, thinking about how we can apply these insights to our local engagements, I'd like to end by borrowing a framework for discerning next steps from a late professor of mine, Father Donald Cousins, who got himself into some good trouble writing against clericalism and against the sex abuse crisis in the church. In class, he would emphasize the difference between taking a willing and a willful approach to decision-making. Willingness involves openness, receptivity, and creativity, whereas willfulness uses rigid thought patterns. When considering how to move forward after hearing Dr. Little Edwards' insights, do those of us in positions of privilege willfully try to push for collaboration with Black-led organizations at our own pace, or do we willingly respect space necessary to build trust? Do those of us interested in promoting racial justice willfully set our own ambitious goals, or do we willingly seek a balanced approach which allows for sustainable long-term commitment? Do we white Christians in the room willfully seek to center ourselves in our work, or do we willingly respond to the best interests of people of color and those experiencing the silent violence of poverty? Thank you.
Would you like to introduce that? Or shall I do that? Okay, great. Just before we break out for dialogue groups, we have just a couple of minutes. So could I invite questions from the audience for Dr. Little Edwards or for Terry?
What is the official definition of multiracial?
Yeah, it's a really great question.
In a congregation.
Yeah.
Our congregation has one Black family.
Mm-hmm.
Do we qualify?
No. Oh, well, I shouldn't say that. It depends on how many other families there are. So if there are 4 white families or 4, then I would say yes, but I'm guessing there are more than 4. Well, in the literature, we use an 80-20 benchmark. So no more than 80%, one group is no more than 80% of the church. Yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Edwards, thank you again for coming here and speaking to us. I'm a Glenberry brother. We work in the South, and a lot of the missions I've been to lately have been very diverse missions, working with African pastors, African American pastors, and whatnot in the area. So, as you were kind of saying when you were talking about the bit of diversity of like the Black pastor or the Asian pastor, how do you think minority pastors or faith leaders can bring their minorityness and their experience to the table in bridging this gap of inequality and injustice?
When it comes to resources?
Racial, sorry.
Yeah. So I think when I speak to pastors of color of multiracial churches, the first thing is, because that's a big question, I think actually the first thing is building community. I know that sounds like it's simple, but and maybe that's actually consistent with where we are at this university, but I actually think a big part of it is building community. That they don't necessarily know of one another, and there's not institutional support for promoting the building of those relationships. So I think that that's actually the first step is building community. And the second step is probably related to that, is doing this together in community. So not just coming together and saying, you go, but coming together, staying together, and moving together is really important, because it's very difficult to make impact alone, or even just a few people in a space. And so that support, that connection, and that networking is really important and critical, a critical first step.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I've been reading your research for a few years, and I find your work fascinating. This opportunity to hear you has been wonderful. Just a matching question to my colleague here. I think white Christians have a different role in this than Christians who happen to be people of color. I understand that your work is not activist, although it can be used for activism. What suggestion would you make? I have been working on racial justice for years, and the resistance among white leadership in the church is significant. And I've lost jobs, because I'm not a Catholic priest. You probably didn't figure that out.
Oh my gosh, I didn't tell you anything about gender, but we'll just stop.
So what advice do you give to white Christians who feel like, okay, I am called to this work, which is how people talk about it, not that it would be just the normal thing that we would do, it would be, oh, I'm called to this work.
Yeah. So my answer is not an easy answer, but I'll go with what I feel in my spirit to say. And that is that, and this is what I love about being in Christian spaces too, because oftentimes I'm not, so I can't go Christian. I have to stay sociological. But, that's what it is to be a Christian ultimately. When we think about our Lord got kicked out all the time. It's a part of what it meant to be standing in the gap, to push against, to call things out. And it's messed up. It doesn't feel good. It's hard. It hurts. And I'm sorry you lost your job. That's what I think. It's really what I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that you don't have the protection of men in Catholicism that men priests do. Yeah. But I actually still have a similar answer to what I responded is community. Is finding your community. I just think community is really one of the first steps, because there just isn't that institutionalized community, that everything in our society, in American society, actually works against it. So this is why it's important. I like to emphasize the context for people, because part of the discouragement could just be like, oh, this is just so hard, I can't. But if you realize that you're up against structures that are making it hard for you, then you can begin to map out a plan to move forward to building community. So I go back to that, the importance of community, the importance of connections with people, where you can support one another, where you can build a sense of mutuality, where you can be loved and cared for. When it is hard. Yeah, so that's so finding those people who are in the same space as you, I think is really a first step. Yes. Hope that's helpful.
So Kateri, how do you find support?
Oh, through community. I mean,
That's an answer.
Can I ask you a question, a follow-up to that?
Sure.
A part of me wonders is this is also generational. So I wonder, because you're younger, I do wonder about, there's some informal networks and structures that allow younger, but I don't know. I could be wrong.
Generational in terms of how we see community specifically.
Parcel, yeah, I think I wonder, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, generationally, there's all kinds of interesting things happening. There's social media, which, simultaneously makes us hyper connected and also feel more isolated in some ways. I mean, personally, I feel very grateful to have spent some years in Dayton, which really does emphasize community in a very strong way. So I have wonderful support present here. So yeah, in terms of generational community, though, I do think a lot of folks my age feel relatively isolated. entering adulthood and not having built-in community support. So I think, being part of a faith community is critical to that, being able to maintain sustainable relationships.
I have a couple of questions that are context related, and the first is comparing the civic organizations to the faith-based organizations. I'm just wondering, given the history and longevity of some of those civic organizations, did any of the ministers or did any of the people from those organizations talk about the fact that they had that lived experience? I mean, we have people here in Dayton that knew Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
Which is it puts them in a different frame of mind, and their motivation maybe is different than somebody who hasn't had that experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So yes, there are people in the sample who have those, and I would say that's that civil rights movement credential. Even what I found in the study is that even if you didn't have that credential, or even if you weren't close to that, it was a way to communicate who we should listen to and who we should follow. It guided the kind of work that the Black religious leader community would be engaged in. So it had a lot to do with how they perceived themselves and what they valued as what it means to be a Black pastor. And so to be a Black pastor is in many ways to embody what you see, or the narrative of the civil rights movement pastor, that priest and prophet combination. And that had an impact on how they saw themselves when they came, as a group, when they came together, what we should do, how we should approach it. What we talk about in the book, though, is we say that has limitations when we're moving into the 21st century, where there are other kinds of issues related to race and racial inequality and racial injustice that are just different than what was going on in the middle of the 20th century, that the civil rights movement was addressing. So there's a bit of a disconnect on the tools that are still cultivated and the capacity to be able to apply those tools to the contemporary moment. Does that answer your question?
It does. And then my follow-up question, it actually speaks to the contemporary moment.
Yeah.
Because of the time frame of your research, what are you seeing, or have you started to explore in terms of where we've been these last 4 to 6 years?
I think, I do. I think I can't really speak to that directly. I think a large part of, so I'll speak, I haven't done any research, but I'm in conversation with pastors regularly. And a big part of it, and anybody who's a pastor or priest, says, it's really changed how people do church. So I think that we're in a very interesting moment where now a lot of pastors and priests are really sort of rethinking how is it that we're going to do church. And so that's a big part of it. What does it even mean for me to be a religious leader now that people are exposed to what's going on the internet and in YouTube? And as one pastor said, he was telling about his mother. He's talking about his mother. He says, my mom, she's like, I'm not going to back. I can watch TD Jakes sitting right here in my slippers and my coffee, right, with my coffee. So I think that actually has a lot to do with it. So we have to take into account how churches change. I also do think one thing what's been encouraging to me is I do think it actually is speaking to the book Smart Suits, Tattered Foods, does resonate with a lot of younger Black pastors actually. And so there's something there that's speaking to them. I don't know. I think that we might, what I'm hoping is that we'll begin to see younger Black pastors more engaged, as well as other religious leaders, but that's who you're talking about. So that's what I'm responding to.
So let's get a round of applause.